Imagine this. It is 42 degrees below zero, a temperature so brutal that your breath doesn't drift away. It shatters into crystals the moment it leaves your lips. The cold no longer feels like weather. It feels like a living thing, pressing against your chest, probing for weakness, waiting for that one mistake. You stand in the middle of a modern city, swallowed by a snowstorm. Neon lights blur behind a curtain of ice. Cars crawl through frozen streets. And there you are, wrapped in a $330 high-tech, waterproof, breathable shell. Zippers sealed, Velcro tight, membranes engineered in laboratories. Everything science promised should keep you warm, and yet you are shivering. Now, let the world around you fade. Let the skyline fall away. Step with me across centuries into a silent frozen forest where snow hangs heavy on the pines. There, in the same murderous wind, stands a medieval traveller, or perhaps a Viking crossing a winter ridge. No synthetic jacket, no petroleum-based fabrics, no microfleece, no Gore-Tex, no miracle materials, just linen, just wool, and sometimes a cloak edged with fur. Their home is not a thermostat-controlled apartment. It's a drafty hut, warmed by a single hearth that might flicker out in the night. Their world is not comfort, it's survival. And yet, archaeological evidence from the Secrets of the Ice project shows something astonishing. These people weren't just enduring the cold, they were mastering it. So the question rises like a ghost in the snow. Why does your $330 jacket fail, while so-called primitive clothing systems carried entire civilizations through winters far harsher than anything most of us will ever face? Is it possible that in our chase for convenience, in our addiction to efficiency and synthetic shortcuts, we have forgotten laws of physics our ancestors learned through suffering, through observation, and sometimes through death? Today, on Historia Prime, we are not simply examining old garments. We are uncovering a lost scientific language, an ancient literacy of insulation, airflow, moisture, and heat. A system built not on branding, but on physics, not on fashion, but on survival. So stay with me as we step into the world of the medieval modular microclimate, an engineering masterpiece made of nothing more than plants, animals, skill, and the unforgiving wisdom of winter. In the next minutes, you will understand why natural fibers outperform modern synthetics, and why, hidden in your very own closet, there might be a silent killer waiting for the first true cold snap. This is the forgotten science of staying alive, and it begins with a shiver and a secret. Part 1. The Silent Saboteur. Why Cotton Kills. Before we can admire the brilliance of medieval cold-weather engineering, we have to confront a quiet enemy hiding in almost every modern closet. Outdoor experts have a saying often repeated with a grim seriousness that newcomers think is exaggerated. Cotton kills. But it isn't a joke, and it isn't an exaggeration. In the wrong conditions, your conditions, my conditions, real-world conditions, cotton can turn an ordinary winter day into a survival crisis. Picture a simple cotton t-shirt. Soft, familiar, comfortable, innocent. Now zoom in. Under a microscope, its fibers look like tiny, thirsty chains. Chains made of cellulose that cling to water with microscopic hooks. Cotton is hydrophilic, which means it loves moisture. It grabs on, it holds on, it refuses to let go. And this becomes your downfall, because even at 42 degrees below zero, the human body sweats. The moment you move, climb, walk, shovel, even breathe harder, moisture begins to wick into that cotton layer. And cotton responds exactly the way nature designed it to. It absorbs everything, up to 27 times its weight. But the moment cotton becomes wet, something catastrophic happens. Those fluffy pockets of air, the only thing giving cotton its tiny bit of insulation, collapse. The fibers flatten. They cling directly to your skin. And now, instead of wearing something warm, you are wrapped in a sponge. A sponge that conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air. A sponge that drags your core temperature downward with every step. A sponge that can push you toward hypothermia even when the air feels harmless. This is the silent saboteur. This is why so many people mysteriously freeze despite wearing layers. And medieval people, without thermodynamics, without moisture charts, without laboratory fabrics, knew this danger instinctively. Cotton, in their world, was a rare luxury imported from faraway lands. They didn't base their survival on something as unforgiving as cotton. Instead, they built their clothing around a philosophy we've nearly forgotten: moisture management. To them, staying alive wasn't about trapping heat at all costs. It was about controlling moisture, keeping the body in a careful balance where sweat never had the chance to become ice. They understood, through experience, not textbooks, that wet fabric is a death sentence in winter. And so, the medieval clothing system begins with eliminating the very mistake our modern wardrobes encourage. Cotton kills, but knowledge protects. And as we move deeper into their world, you'll see how 1,000 years ago, ordinary people built a clothing system so perfectly tuned to the laws of physics that even our most advanced jackets still struggle to compete. Stay with me. The true genius of their survival system is only beginning to unfold. Part 2. The medieval Trinity, the three-layer engine. To understand how medieval people walked through killing cold as if it were nothing more than a winter breeze, we must step into the heart of their clothing system. Their survival at -42 degrees wasn't built on a single miracle fabric. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. It was engineering raw, instinctive, empirical engineering refined through centuries of trial, error, and brutal winters. What they created was a microclimate, a living chamber of warm, dry air that wrapped the body like an invisible shield. And this chamber was powered by 3 layers, each performing a precise function. Together, they formed what I call the medieval Trinity, a 3-layer engine that outperforms many of our modern systems even today. Let's begin with the first layer, the moisture-wicking interface, the linen chemise. Closest to the skin, this was the uncelebrated workhorse of medieval survival. In a world without detergents, without dryers, without washing machines, the chemise was the sacrificial layer. It absorbed sweat, oils, and salts so the valuable wool garments above it could stay clean and efficient. But beyond hygiene, linen possessed a secret superpower. Made from the flax plant, it has natural capillary action. Unlike cotton, it doesn't collapse when wet. Linen retains its structure, pulling moisture away from the skin, spreading it out, and releasing it into the layers above. It prevents that deadly dampness from lingering, which is the very first rule of cold weather survival. Your skin must stay dry. And once the linen has done its job, the second layer awakens. The insulating engine. Wool, in all its forms, the kirtle, the tunic, the hose. Wool is one of nature's greatest achievements. Under a microscope, each wool fiber looks like a tiny coiled spring. This crimped structure traps millions of pockets of still air, and in the world of thermodynamics, still air is gold. It is one of the best insulators known to science. But wool goes further. It is chemically alive. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in water vapor without feeling wet. And as it does, something extraordinary happens. It releases heat. This exothermic reaction, the heat absorption, acts like a miniature furnace, smoothing out temperature swings and buffering the wearer against the cold. Meanwhile, lanolin on the surface repels liquid water, ensuring the wool remains breathable instead of suffocating. This is why medieval villagers, travelers, and warriors alike could stay warm through storms that would send modern hikers back to their cars. Wool didn't just trap heat, it managed moisture, regulated temperature, and created a dynamic insulation system. And then comes the final layer, the weather shield, the cloak, sometimes lined with fur. While modern jackets cling tightly to the body, compressing insulation and reducing loft, the medieval cloak did the opposite. It draped over the shoulders, wrapped around the torso and legs, and created a cavern of warm air around the entire body. By increasing the volume of air and reducing exposed surface area, the cloak dramatically slowed the rate of heat loss. And it was adjustable. If the wearer overheated, the cloak could be opened with one motion, venting excess moisture before it became dangerous. Modern parkas often trap sweat in the worst possible moment. The medieval cloak prevented that failure long before anyone understood the physics behind it. 3 layers, 3 rolls, 1 microclimate. Linen kept the skin dry. Wool generated and preserved warmth. The cloak shielded everything from the brutality of the wind. And together, they formed a system so effective that even today, despite our advanced textiles, our reflective foils, our engineered membranes, we are only beginning to rediscover why it worked so flawlessly. This wasn't fashion. This was survival science, woven by hand. And in the next part of our journey, we'll discover why your expensive modern jacket, your membranes, your zippers, your synthetic insulation, can fail catastrophically where this ancient system continues to triumph. The medieval engineers had no degrees, no laboratories, and no patents. But they had something even more powerful. They had to get it right, or they wouldn't live long enough to try again. Part 3. The Gore-Tex Paradox and Why Your $330 Jacket Fails. At this point you might be thinking, but my jacket has Gore-Tex. It's engineered to breathe. It's the best modern science can offer. And on paper, that's true. But in the real world, especially in the brutal quiet of -42 degrees, paper promises can become deadly illusions. Because here lies the engineering paradox buried inside your high-tech winter armor. Modern jackets depend on a microscopic membrane called EPTFE. This membrane doesn't magically suck moisture outward. It relies on a vapor pressure gradient, meaning the air inside the jacket must be warmer and more humid than the air outside. Only then can your sweat be pushed outward through the microscopic pores of the membrane. But in extreme cold, that gradient collapses. And when it collapses, so does the entire system. The moment freezing rain saturates the outer fabric, a failure known as wetting out, your jacket stops breathing entirely. The membrane becomes overwhelmed. Your sweat has nowhere to go. It condenses inside the shell, clinging to the interior like frost on a window pane. And as the temperature drops further, that trapped moisture freezes. Imagine wearing a suit of ice. That is the hidden fate of modern technical gear in conditions medieval travelers faced every winter. Now shift your eyes from the modern failure to a very old solution, the medieval fuller. Long before synthetic membranes existed, fullers treated wool through a process of soaking and trampling in alkaline baths. This caused the wool fibers to intertwine, shrink, and mat into a dense fabric known as loden. But here is the miracle they probably never articulated in scientific terms. Loden wool became naturally wind-resistant, naturally water-repellent, and naturally breathable. The lanolin, the sheep's own protective oil, remained in the fibers. That lanolin created a barrier that shed water, not unlike a waxed shell, yet it never trapped moisture inside. Air and vapor passed through gently, continuously, without relying on fragile gradients or chemical laminates. It was nature's Gore-Tex, without Gore-Tex. And more importantly, it didn't fail when the mercury plunged. But the weaknesses of our modern jackets don't end with membranes. They're also stitched into every zipper. A zipper is not insulation. A zipper is a thermal bridge, a highway through which heat escapes and cold air invades. In extreme cold, a metal zipper can freeze shut or even freeze to your skin. Plastic zippers, meanwhile, become stiff, brittle, and prone to snapping. Every zipper is a wound in your armor. Medieval people avoided this entirely. They fastened their garments with wooden toggles, bone pins, or simple overlapping fabric. No conducting metal, no brittle plastic, no mechanical failure points. Their clothing was engineered, intentionally or intuitively, to remove the vulnerabilities we've built into our own. This is the uncomfortable truth of Part 3. Your expensive jacket is not failing because you bought the wrong brand. It's failing because its entire design philosophy is fragile. Meanwhile, medieval clothing was built like military equipment, simple, robust, resistant to failure, and brutally honest about the realities of winter. In the search for convenience, we created complexity. But in the search for survival, they created resilience. And as we continue deeper into this forgotten science, you'll see just how many more lessons they mastered. Lessons we desperately need to rediscover. Part 4. Indigenous Superiority, the Reindeer Lesson. To truly understand the brilliance of ancient cold-weather engineering, we don't need to rely solely on medieval Europe. We can turn our attention even farther north, to the Arctic, where indigenous societies faced temperatures that make -42 look almost forgiving. These communities lived, traveled, hunted, and thrived in some of the harshest environments on Earth, and they did it without synthetics, without laboratories, and without multi-million-dollar research programs. And modern science has finally begun to understand why their systems worked so astonishingly well. A landmark study put traditional reindeer and caribou skin clothing head-to-head against cutting-edge, military-grade Arctic gear, designed with decades of engineering, computer modeling, and extreme weather testing behind it. The researchers expected the modern suits to outperform everything else, but the results were not just surprising, they were humbling. Traditional reindeer skin clothing outperformed the military's best equipment by 12%. 12% might sound small, but in the world of thermodynamics, that can mean the difference between frostnip and frostbite, between endurance and collapse, between life and death. Thermal imaging told the deeper story. Modern jackets, no matter how advanced, glowed with bright streaks around zippers, seams, and joints. Heat was leaking out like water through cracked pottery. The human body was pouring precious warmth into the environment, and the gear designed to protect it was riddled with escape routes. But the reindeer hood? Something extraordinary happened there. The fur trim created a boundary layer, a swirling halo of turbulent air that shielded the face from the wind. Instead of heat leaking outward, the exterior temperature of the hood matched the ambient air almost perfectly. Thermal cameras showed near-zero heat loss, as if the wearer were wrapped inside a portable fortress. Meanwhile, your $330 jacket, viewed through the same camera, would shine like a Christmas tree, brilliant streaks of orange and yellow bleeding into the sky. Every seam a weakness, every zipper a glowing wound. And here lies the deeper lesson. Form-fitting clothing, something we consider sleek, athletic, high performance, is a fatal design flaw in extreme cold. Tight cuts compress insulation, restrict airflow, and trap moisture exactly where it becomes most dangerous. Modern jackets cling to the body, but traditional garments, from Siberia to Scandinavia to the Canadian Arctic, were intentionally wide, long, and voluminous. They didn't fight to trap heat. They invited heat to circulate. They built moving microclimates around the body, allowing warm air to distribute itself while excess moisture escaped harmlessly. Our ancestors understood a truth that many modern designers still overlook. The real shield against the void isn't plastic, it's trapped air. A layer of still, warm air maintained by clever tailoring, natural fibers, and breathing materials acts as an impenetrable barrier where synthetic membranes fail. This is the reindeer lesson, a lesson carved into the wind, a lesson passed from generation to generation across frozen continents, and a lesson that reminds us that primitive doesn't mean simple, it means perfected. In a world that keeps turning toward complex solutions, the Arctic peoples and the medieval engineers we've been studying stand as living proof that sometimes the most powerful technology is the one shaped by nature, not by industry. And in the next chapter, we will turn inward to the human body itself to uncover another secret our ancestors knew instinctively, a secret we have almost forgotten. Part 5. The atrophy of the human furnace. There is a deeper, more unsettling truth behind our modern struggle with the cold, one that has nothing to do with jackets, fabrics, or fashion. It comes from within us, because long before our clothing began to fail, our bodies did. Modern humans live inside what scientists call thermoneutral zones. We wake in heated bedrooms, walk through warm hallways, step into climate-controlled cars, and spend our days in offices and houses insulated from the seasons. Winter becomes something we observe through a window rather than something we endure. And because of this, something ancient, something powerful, has been quietly fading away inside us. Our internal furnace has begun to atrophy. Our ancestors possessed a biological tool most of us barely use anymore: brown adipose tissue, often called brown fat. Unlike the white fat that simply stores energy, brown fat is a living engine. It is filled with mitochondria, the microscopic power plants of the human body, and when exposed to cold, it ignites. It performs what biologists call non-shivering thermogenesis, burning calories directly into heat, warming the body from the inside out without a single tremor. For a medieval peasant, this wasn't an emergency response. It was daily life. The constant exposure to cold recruited and expanded their brown fat stores. They developed faster shivering reflexes, stronger vascular control, and more efficient heat distribution to protect their core organs. Their bodies were not fragile machines requiring heated seats and insulated walls. They were biological furnaces, built, trained, and hardened by the world around them. And so, when they wrapped themselves in linen and wool and fur, they weren't just wearing insulation. They were pairing natural materials with a powerful internal engine. Their clothing worked with their biology, not in place of it. Now picture us, wrapped in synthetic shells, living in perpetual climate control, touching cold air only long enough to walk from door to car. Our bodies rarely receive the signal that says, prepare, adapt, strengthen. The furnace never lights, the brown fat never grows. The biological wisdom our ancestors carried in their cells slowly fades in ours. We haven't just lost old clothing systems, we've lost the physiology those systems were designed to support. In our desire for comfort, we have unintentionally de-skilled our own biology. We've made ourselves dependent on gadgets, heaters, and insulation that can and will fail. And when they do, we discover the frightening truth that our bodies, once tuned to survive the cold, now shiver and buckle at temperatures our ancestors weathered with nothing more than wool and willpower. This is the fifth lesson of the medieval cold weather system. Survival isn't just something you wear, it's something you train. And as we move into the next part of our story, we'll see that this ancient wisdom wasn't only stored in human cells, it was carved into their homes, stitched into their tools, and preserved in the very ice that still hides their secrets. Part 6. Wisdom carved in ice and turf. The story of medieval cold weather mastery isn't preserved only in ancient manuscripts or forgotten techniques. It is carved into the earth itself and frozen into the glaciers that still guard the artifacts of those who walked before us. In 2019, archaeologists from Norway's Secrets of the Ice project uncovered something extraordinary: a complete Viking mitten sealed in ice for over 1,000 years. When they lifted it from the glacier, it wasn't just a relic, it was a revelation. The mitten was woven from dense wool yarn, crafted in a complex pattern designed to trap as much air as possible. Every twist, every loop, every layer of fabric had a purpose. This wasn't clothing stitched for comfort or fashion. It was technology. It was engineering. It was survival distilled into fiber. And the brilliance didn't stop at what they wore. It extended into what they built. Consider the Scandinavian peat house, a structure not built on the land, but almost grown into it. Instead of fighting the cold with thin walls and constant fire, they embraced the physics of earth and air. Walls of turf, sometimes more than a meter thick, surrounded the living space. These turf blocks acted like enormous thermal batteries. During the day, a single fire warmed the interior. At night, the walls slowly released that stored heat back into the home. The result was nothing short of astonishing. While a modern stick-frame house can lose its warmth in a matter of hours during a power outage, a medieval peat house could remain above freezing for as long as 72 hours, with no fire at all. 72 hours of protection, 72 hours of stability, 72 hours of survival. Why? Because they weren't designing for convenience, they were designing for failure. They planned for storms that lasted weeks, for nights when wood was scarce, for winters when a single mistake could cost a family their lives. Their homes, like their clothing, were built on a philosophy we often overlook today. Heat saved is better than heat produced. In our modern world, we trust the grid. We rely on heaters. We assume the thermostat will obey. But they lived with a deeper truth, one forged in snow, sharpened by hunger, and tested by time. They knew that resilience wasn't a luxury, it was the foundation of survival. And so, the wisdom carved in ice and turf stands before us like a quiet challenge. It reminds us that our ancestors weren't primitive. They were precise. They were observant. They engineered their world fiber by fiber, wall by wall, to withstand the cold, not for hours, but for generations. As we approach the conclusion of this journey, the question becomes clear. If their clothing, their homes, and even their bodies were all tuned for survival, what can we learn from their mastery before the next true cold finds us unprepared? Conclusion: the prophetic past. So now we arrive at the final question, not for the medieval world, but for us, the people of the 21st century, wrapped in technology, insulated by convenience, and yet somehow more fragile than any generation before us. We like to believe that history moves in a straight line, that every new invention is an improvement, that every upgrade makes us stronger. But the medieval clothing system exposes a truth we rarely confront. Progress is not guaranteed. Literacy, real survival literacy, can be lost. And in our pursuit of comfort, we have quietly traded resilience for convenience. A medieval peasant, standing at 42 degrees below zero, was not waiting helplessly for the weather to pass. They were a master of their environment. Their clothing wasn't fashion, it was a layered microclimate. Their body wasn't weak, it was a furnace tuned by daily cold. Their home wasn't a box of timber, it was a thermal engine carved into the earth itself. They understood something we often forget. Survival isn't about overpowering nature. It's about understanding it so deeply that you move with it, not against it. So the next time you shop for winter gear, don't be seduced by waterproof labels, flashy technical names, or price tags that promise miracles. Look instead at the materials. Reach for the wool. Reach for the fibers that breathe, that insulate, that manage moisture instead of trapping it. And step back from the cotton, silent killer hiding in your wardrobe. And beyond clothing, maybe take one step further. Step out into the cold once in a while. Let your body remember what it means to generate heat. Let your forgotten furnace flicker back to life. Because the wisdom we need is still here. It is stored in the turf walls of ancient houses, in the coils of Viking mittens, in the teachings of Arctic hunters, and in the brown fat of our own biology. It has been waiting patiently for us to rediscover it. And so, Historia Prime leaves you with a question, one not meant to frighten, but to awaken. If the power went out tonight, and the temperature fell to -42, would you be a master of your environment, or a victim of your wardrobe? The past has already given us the answers. All that remains is whether we choose to use them. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe so together we can continue unearthing the forgotten survival knowledge that once shaped civilizations and may one day save us again.